how's everybody doing tonight? Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you. That was unfortunate. but we're here.
15 minutes.
Yeah, we're here. That's all that matters. Thank you for coming to Flyleaf Books to hear about Nabil Ayers talk about his new book, My Life in the Sunshine. And he's also joined by fellow author, John Darnielle. Got it right. Nabil Ayers is the president of Beggars Group USA, where he has released several albums by many Grammy Award-winning artists. Ayers has written about music and race for publications including the New York Times, NPR, Rolling Stone, and GQ. He currently resides in the great United States town of Brooklyn, New York. And John Darnielle's first novel, Wolf and White Van, great book, was a New York Times bestseller, National Book Award nominee, and a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for First Fiction, and widely held as one of the best novels of the year. He's a writer, of course, a composer, a guitarist, and vocalist for the band The Mountain Goats, which I have heard nothing but great things about. And he lives in Durham, North Carolina, with his wife and his sons. Thank you, everybody. Usually we close at 7 o'clock, but given the circumstances, we're going to extend that to around 7:30, 7:45-ish if you want to look around the store afterwards. Just let us know and we'll help you out, me and my fellow coworkers up front. Thank you. We hope you enjoy and have a great night.
Are we here?
Yeah. You're there. Am I here?
No, you got to flip on the. There's a button.
That's why you're the singer in a band.
That's right.
I'm not.
Yeah.
I work with these. So my name is John Darnielle, and I sing in a band called the Mountain Goats. And thank you. And our stuff, I've always called it boutique taste. It was like I was not looking to get successful. I was just doing a thing, but gathered enough momentum that at one point I got signed to the English label 4AD, which also has an English office. And that's how I met Nabil, who was working in the Manhattan office of the Beggars Group. In music, often smaller labels will band together in order to get the records in stores when you used to have records in stores. But you still need chains of distribution. You need people who are working your records. You need publicists. You need label heads to know the difference between a record that's ready to go and one that's not. And you need people who form relationships with the workers in the office and the musicians. Nabil was the head man in that office by the time I left that label, and we've kept in touch ever since. He is widely known to be one of the best guys in the business. But before you did that, you've been in music for a long time. Walk us through the stuff you did before you got to Beggars.
Oh man, in college, that's when I was like DJing at a college radio station, interning at a record company.
And where was that?
The University of Puget Sound in Tacoma.
All right.
Tacoma, Washington. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and that was like early 90s, so an incredible time to be in the Northwest. All the grunge stuff was happening and everything. And then I got a job at a record store that I loved. And then my friend and I opened a record store, Sonic Boom Records in Seattle, when we were both 25. And that was kind of the thing I did for a while. I also put out records on my own small label, played drums in several bands and toured a lot. But so always kind of played music and worked in music. And then started at 4AD in 2009. That's when we kind of crossed over. Maybe 2010 is when, 9 or 10.
One of your bands got signed by a major label during the big major label.
A couple did, yeah. Neither one ever blew up or did well, but I certainly got to be part of that whole thing. And the A&R person's aunt is here, which is pretty funny. That was an incredible, weird experience. And in a way, I knew it maybe wasn't as fun as it should have been because I'd interned at a major label and worked in a record store. So even when we were 23 in my band, The Lemons, when we signed to Mercury, I was like, hope our record comes out. That was seriously how I felt in the limo.
Because you had seen records get shelved. Right. You know that happens.
Yep. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So from there, how do you wind up at Beggars?
I'm trying to think. When I had Sonic Boom, the record store, that really allowed me, that was my job, and I played in bands, and I also put out records on my own label. I was a scout for Epic Records for 3 years, in which my job was clearly never to sign anything. It was to just tell them about cool stuff so they could say, oh yeah, we knew about TV on the radio. that was seriously I realized oh, that's what I'm here for, just fine. They can keep paying me to tell them about stuff. And so I think there's enough kind of record company stuff and record store stuff and music stuff and I just really got along well with the 4AD people when I first met them, and so that's how that ended up happening. I wasn't looking for a job. I moved to New York to kind of work on my own label full time and do that more, and just ended up in a way falling into it.
Which is amazing. So your book is about your relationship to Roy Ayers, right? Who was your birth father?
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Does everybody here know the music of Roy Ayers? He, incredibly influential musician. I have I'm not good at looking at my notes. I went to a site called Who Sampled that lists all the places that somebody's been sampled. If you look at a James Brown record on those, any given James Brown side will have 100 pages. Roy had about 79 pages of samples. Tribe Called Quest, Everybody, Mace. You can't name a hip hop act from '87 onwards who didn't sample him during the glory age of sampling. He was in that, I don't know if the word's still in vogue, Afrocentric sort of, culturally aware style of jazz that was rising in the wake of Miles going electric and stuff like that. But you didn't know him growing up. Talk a little about that.
Yeah, I didn't know him at all. My mother, who I'm still very close to and lives in Brooklyn, I see every week, she was 20. She didn't really know what she wanted to do. She grew up in Long Island, moved to New York City like a lot of kids do, I think, after college, and was just kind of figuring things out and wanted to be a young single mother. And she knew that for some reason at 20. And my uncle, Alan, who's 2 years younger than my mother, is a jazz musician. He'd met Roy a couple times. They weren't like good friends, but they just kind of knew each other. And my uncle and my mother were out at, I think, the Village Gate one night, ran into Roy. They all started talking, and my mother, the way she describes it, she just said, "This is the person I'm going to have a child with." She just decided at that moment, she's like, "This is him. He has all the stuff, whatever, the charisma, he's kind, he's good looking, all these qualities." And it wasn't, "This is the person I'm going to marry," or "This is the person I'm going to be with." It was, "This is the person who's going to be the father of my child." And so they dated, in air quotes, I think 3 times over the course of a year. It's never like a real relationship. And the 3rd time she said, "I want to have a kid. I want you to be the father. You don't have to be involved." And he said, "Okay." And so that was the agreement. I've always known that. It was never hidden from me. It was never like, something I would learn when I was older and was able to process it. It was, I always knew it, and it was always a positive thing. It was never like, "Well, your father didn't be around, he didn't want to be around, or there wasn't a divorce, he didn't leave us." It was always, he was talked about as like, "Wow, we got this great thing from him."
Right,
which is me.
Yeah, but so you weren't experiencing a longing for a loss.
Right.
And you were in a loving home. You were
a loving home, and grew up, especially for the first 10 years of my life, in places where there's nothing weird about me. And my father is black, my mother's white. Father wasn't in the picture, we didn't have money, she was young, all these things. And there were so many people that were just like that, where I was in New York City and Amherst, Massachusetts, especially, and Cambridge. So it wasn't even, I really had like a totally normal childhood, even though it sounds so abnormal.
Yeah, but through the course of the book, your relationship to being black sort of becomes a more important factor in your life. When you moved to the West Coast, did you notice different dynamics in play on that? I'll tell you, I did, because I grew up in Southern California,
right,
where even the appearance of saying something racist can get you in a lot of trouble. And I moved to Portland when I was 18, and I could not believe
Portland, Oregon,
openly racist people running around Portland, which just seemed very enlightened, when you land there, and it was quite remarkable to me, because people would talk in a way that would get your face punched where I come from. And so, so I wondered if you had any experiences like that moving out to the Northwest.
Not so much that, but I did just notice. I went to college in Seattle, or outside of Seattle, as I mentioned, then right after college moved to Seattle proper. And I do remember just noticing how incredibly white I thought it was, and how it didn't seem racist. In fact, it seemed very
chill. That
version of Black Lives Matter and liberal and open and everything. Yeah. But everyone was kind of white everywhere, and maybe that's why.
Yeah. No, there's in Portland, it always feels that way. And you learn after you live there for a while on the far northeast side, it's like de facto segregated. That's where.
Oh, really?
Or this, I'm talking about 1986.
Yeah,
I can't speak to now. So the first time you saw him, I have a thing about this that I dug up. The first time you actually saw your father with conscious eyes was on the 12th of May. 1979.
Oh wow, got the date, amazing.
Yeah, well, I have a date because I listened to the Grateful Dead.
Oh,
And Roy was opening for the Dead that night on the bill with who else?
Patti Smith was the middle band. It's a pretty insane show.
So let me see if I can.
You there?
So
Chica's was on the stage.
I don't know if you see this on my messy laptop, but the night that Nabil first saw his father was dressed like this. Because that's the show.
Oh yeah. Amazing.
And what was that like? Did it bring stuff up, or did you feel sort of detached?
I remember it well. It didn't really bring stuff up. I mean, the way, because it was never presented to me like we're going to see your father. This
Right.
is an important moment. You've never met this person. And I know, of course, as you know, you can't include everything in the book. There's more. I'd met him a couple other times, but I don't remember those times.
Right.
But those were in my head. My mother telling me that the first time I actually met him, I think I was around 2 years old. We ran into him on the street, and the way she tells it, she's like, and I introduced you. And he said, oh, wow, great, congratulations. And that was it.
Right.
And so I knew that. So even going into this, I knew it wasn't a big deal. We were just going to see, I was excited to be going to a big rock concert. I already played drums and was super into music. And the father part of it wasn't a huge deal. So we went, and I remember the concert really well. It was actually, he played early. He played like noon, I think. It was totally light out. It was sunny, which I remember because I remember the sunshine and the song and all that. And I do remember noticing all the things that my mother talked about, like seeing how he interacted with the crowd and just even the whatever, wave your hands and people do that. I don't remember exactly, but just the idea that wow, people are gravitating towards this person. Not
charisma,
like a command thing, but he has them. They're engaged. They're interested in what he's doing. I remember noticing that. I remember smelling pot and understanding, already knowing what that was.
At a Dead show, you said?
Yeah, right. Yeah, in Amherst in 1979. Right. And we didn't stick around for Patti Smith or the Dead. Apparently, we did go backstage and talk to him, but I don't remember that. That part of it, and I wrote about it, but I wrote about what my mother told me about it.
But you already had a favorite band at that point, and it was
Kiss.
Kiss. That's right. And so you were playing music at this point.
Oh yeah, my uncle bought me a drum set when I was 2, so
wow.
I was already playing for years. Yeah.
And do you still play?
I do. I mean, not enough. I don't have drums at home because I live in New York in an apartment, so I play a couple times a year with friends out of town. Not enough. So.
It's always weird, but this seems like a good place to throw in a reading from the book to give us a sense of what you're talking about and to maybe suggest where we should go next. I have a copy right here.
Oh, I've got one right here.
Oh, yeah.
Well, is there a section?
No, I always like the writer to pick.
Based on, I've been doing the intro a lot, but we've already talked a bit, so I wonder, maybe I should read the UMass, but that concert part.
Yeah, go for that.
I don't know if I've ever done that. I have to find it. Talk amongst yourselves for a moment.
You'll be on page 32.
This is amazing. Can you come everywhere?
Well, I've done 3 books.
Right, exactly. Okay, so let's see. That's so it looks like 31, right? If we start at the beginning.
Oh, is that right? 31, that's right.
Oh, this is a short chapter. Maybe I'll just try to hit the whole thing.
Go for it.
When I was 7, I got to go backstage at a concert for the first time. The show was at the UMass football stadium, which was just 1 mile from where my mother and I lived. I distinctly remember the gray cement hallways felt cold and futuristic as we worked our way through a cast of fast-moving, colorful characters. The people carried the familiar and universal energy of music that I'd already sensed at concerts in New York and Cambridge. But actually being behind the scenes was more intimate. Important-looking men and women spoke into walkie-talkies. Others traversed the hallways, carrying guitars and water coolers. I knew that all of these tasks, no matter how mundane, were part of a bigger picture, and I was fascinated by even the most minor detail. During the concert, my mother and I watched from the loosely crowded photographer's pit, close to the gigantic stage, and I tried to make sense of everyone's role, from the musicians to the techs, who crouched as they scurried around. The afternoon audience seemed more interested in the scene than the music. That all changed when the person we'd come to see walked on stage. Roy Ayers had arrived. Roy's song, Everybody Loves the Sunshine, was just 3 years old at the time. Though it wasn't the first time I'd heard the song, we owned the album, it was the first time I recall feeling connected to it, and it's the first time that I'd heard it performed live outside in the afternoon sunshine. As the lazy chords drifted over the audience, I remember feeling a gentle breeze on my arm and smelling what I already knew was marijuana smoke from the slow swaying bodies around me. We owned a few of Roy's records, and I knew that he was my father. My mother and I had run into him a few times in New York when I was too young to remember, but this was the first time I'd seen him perform. And as much as I was taken by his music, I was drawn to his personality. I could tell that he was a star through the way he smiled, the way he pointed or nodded to acknowledge individual people in the crowd, and the enthusiastic way they responded, and the way in which he interacted with his band. When he was on stage, the entire stadium belonged to him. My mother and I left the concert after Roy's set. Later that afternoon, I was in our communal backyard building a rock concert out of Legos on the grass. while my mother read quietly in a flimsy plastic lounge chair. Our soundtrack was a muted thump and indiscernible notes of the concert still happening in the distance. The band, which I'd heard of and had presumed to be a hard rock band due to their name and skeleton logo, was the Grateful Dead. But it was the laid-back groove of Everybody Loves the Sunshine that still dominated my body as I assembled my Legos. It was the perfect soundtrack to the breezy spring afternoon and the smell of fresh-cut grass. The lyrics, my life, my life, my life, my life, in the sunshine, repeated in my head. For a long time, the backstage pass from that concert lived in our photo album. The palm-sized manila peel-off rectangle smelled like medical tape and read in bold green letters, UMass Spring Concert, May 12, 1979. The Grateful Dead, Patti Smith, Roy Ayers, access to all areas. Handwritten on the pass in blue ink in the penmanship of a 7-year-old are 3 words. Boo next to the Grateful Dead, boo next to Patti Smith, yay next to Roy Ayers. Years later, when I was well into my teens, I found out that my mother and I had arrived at the stadium early that day, that she had talked our way backstage by telling the bouncer that I was Roy's son, and that we actually met with him. According to my mother, during that surprise drop-in, she dominated the conversation with a flash update on my 7 years of life, bragging about how I walked at an early age and was 1 grade ahead in school, and about my drumming. She said Rory was exuberant in our exchange, receptive and even somewhat inquisitive, as if catching up after just a few months apart during an otherwise normal life. I don't remember this encounter with my father. I only remember the sound of his music and the way he drew all the sunshine toward him that day.
I think it speaks to the business you wound up in, that like you remember the music from that day. That's what stuck with you, right?
Yeah.
And, so you were already looking toward that. So to get into the weeds, this is a memoir, right? And it's about your relationship to your father somewhat, or you're navigating that. But for you, what is your book about? What are you aiming for? What are you writing about?
That's interesting. No one's asked me that question yet, and it's a really easy answer. To me, the book is about my mother.
Yeah.
And that hasn't come up a lot.
Well, that's the thing, in that scene especially, the way when you speak about her, I write fiction, right?
Yeah.
You can tell with, I think, almost any fictional book, which characters the writer likes.
Right.
And they won't necessarily be the good guys, but you can tell the ones they're doting on, they're babies, the ones that they're trying to make sure you know best.
Right.
And you can tell the ones that are there to clear a space for those people. And every time your mom comes onto the scene, I feel something, right? I notice that you've made room for her. But we'll talk some more about that.
I mean, obviously, people will say like, yeah, you wrote a book, it's about your father. And
Yeah.
I'm like, I guess, the song, the title, everything about it, certainly.
Well, the title was sitting right there.
The whole, the intro, it all obviously is strongly about my father, but I think it's so framed in, as is my life, by the way that she created and treated the relationship that exists, and everything in the book is because of decisions that she made.
Right.
And the sort of takeaway and the play on the title, My Life in the Sunshine, of course, it's the lyric to the song, but it's also about this great life that I've had.
Right.
And I completely attribute that to my mother.
Where did she get that from?
I knew my grandparents really well until I was 30. And she grew up with them in a nice house in Long Island and normal life. My grandfather was a lawyer, but they're like, they were incredibly kind, sweet, wonderful people. But my grandfather was also like a kind of big, loud guy who drank. So my uncle is this kind, unassuming, sweet person who I think didn't let that bother him as much. And the way he talks about their childhood it was incredible. I don't know what she's talking about. And my mother is like, our childhood was really hard. I had a hard time with our father. And so they have two different views of it. So I think it does come from the sweet side of my grandparents, and definitely from my uncle, who's a huge part of my life too, and a huge influence on my mother, even though it's her younger brother.
David.
Alan.
Alan.
Yeah.
Who was who she was living with. When
Yeah. They were like roommates for a while after high school.
So you wrote this book to get to understand your mom better to some extent, right? To figure out who she is in some way.
I don't even know if that was necessarily the goal, but it certainly is what ended up happening. I mean, there were so many. I mean, I interviewed her a lot and really asked a lot of questions for the first time in my life, because she's very forthcoming and talks a lot and has told me more than I've ever wanted to know about a lot of things. But finally, for this, sometimes it's like, okay, get into the details about the night you got pregnant. Which is
quite a story.
Yeah, an interesting thing to have to, meaning I really needed to know for this, and I wanted to get it right, and it's an important part of the story, but to have to sit with your mother and have her tell you about that.
And when you first pitched the book, when you first pitched this idea to her, was she immediately receptive, or was she?
Oh, yeah. She likes attention as much as my father and as much as me, so it's all.
Does she play, or does she write? Does she have
No, she's a dancer, and...
She's a dancer.
She writes a lot, as did my grandmother. My grandmother never published anything, but I have this incredible stack of short stories she wrote when she was younger. Really amazing, about like Brooklyn in the 40s and 50s. And my mother is the same way. I mean, I get 3 emails a day that I consider short stories that are her observations on the subway and making up this person's life. And like really, and so I think that's part of it.
So that's, I don't want to, I think the dramatic sort of arc of the book, there's so much to the book, but one thing you're wondering as you read is like, when are you going to run into Roy again? How's that going to go?
Right.
I don't want to spoil too much of that. It's a, it's a scene, and it's but I sort of feel there's a sense in which what she pours into you is almost a mirror image. It's she makes up for every absence, right?
Right.
In some ways that are quite remarkable. And do you think, so you don't bring, you can imagine a version of this book in which somebody's real mad at Roy.
Right. I've been chastised for not being man enough.
Well, I think as a dad, when I first became a father, the first year or so when you're not sleeping much because the baby doesn't sleep much, you're really open emotionally. Right? And you know, I can't speak to everybody, but for me, it's like, any social outrage I heard about would be magnified in my mind and be very angry. I couldn't hear stories about gruesome murders for a while because I would really feel, especially if children were involved, it was so hard, And when I would hear about like a deadbeat dad, I just get so angry. Right? I would like be sitting with his baby. It's this amazing time, But you don't have that, right?
But I don't have a deadbeat dad.
No, you don't. You just don't have a dad in the picture, right? But I'm wondering, do you think that's in your character, or do you think your mother shaped this reaction for you?
I think it's both. I mean, the character, at least to the shaping part, I mean, really, like, to what I was talking about a little while ago, about how sort of the way in which both my mother and my uncle presented the idea of my father, or presented the fact that we're going to meet him, or the fact that we just met him. Every one of those circumstances was seriously just not a big deal.
Right.
But they definitely did try to sort of create them, meaning there are times when we were invited somewhere, or my mother would take me to a concert on purpose and we would go see him. So they weren't all just run-ins. There were some run-ins, and you can't control those. But the deliberate situations, I really think, and I, of course, have talked to my mother about this, I think she had 2 points to make when she did that. It was, just exposing me to him enough that it wasn't at risk of being hurtful.
Right.
And the other one was for her to show him that we did it.
Yeah.
That's
sort of a ghost.
Look, here it is.
A ghost thread
Remember?
Behind all of this is that she's sort of making sure that he has a space also to remember who he was at one point in time.
Right. Right.
It's one of the things I like about this book. And by the way, if in case you're concerned, I'm not sick, but I was sick last week and I coughed myself hoarse, so I'm going to sound worse and worse in the evening. But I don't have anything that you're going to get. We live in a time where the memoir is kind of the most prevalent book form. There's so many of them, and I'm perennially complaining about it. But this one bucks the trend because the trauma narrative is sort of the governing narrative. Everybody is, and I don't want to disrespect anybody's trauma. I have plenty of my own, right? But I don't necessarily want to read. I don't feel predisposed to share everybody's trauma.
Right.
This is not a trauma narrative. You've chosen not to make it that. Instead,
right.
it's a fairly unique memoir in today's environment. Were you thinking about that when you wrote? Tell me about how, when you were writing, how are you thinking about the book?
Yeah, it started not as a book, which I think is the only way it could become a book. It happened really naturally. So I'm not a writer. I wasn't a writer. I was.
Well, you write fairly well.
Thank you. But I was, running a record company and playing in bands and doing all these fun things. And then I think at some point in my 40s just thought, and this I kind of attribute to the mom and the grandma writing and just liking it. I thought like, wow, I have a lot of stories. It would be fun to write these and to just like start getting them down on paper, not necessarily to publish, not even necessarily for anyone to see, but just because it's fun. And I started doing that and then thought like, oh wow, maybe I should try to publish a couple things about, the bands I used to play in or the record store, the fun, safe, easy stuff. And that started to click. And that's around the time I started dating the woman who's now my wife. And she's like, look, this is all great, this is fun, but you really should write about your father and your race, because that's what you care about and that's what people will care about. And I knew she was right, and I didn't know how to do it, but I was in this rhythm where I just loved writing. Like that's what I look forward to doing on the weekends and my free time and on flights. And so I sort of, the way I decided to do it, I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll write about every time I've met him, and I'll just like sit down and I'll just write about it. And that was, some of those stories are very close to the way they came out in here. And I ran out of those pretty quickly. There were like 5 or 6 stories. And then I started writing about hearing his songs, hearing his music somewhere at a bar, in a club, what that feels like. What it feels like when someone asks me if I'm related to him, kind of like went through all these different sort of versions of meeting my father. And eventually there were probably 10 or 15, some half-page stories, some, the long lunch in Seattle was, a much longer story, 10 pages, I don't know. And so to me it was very visual, this is all on my computer, but I imagine this long wooden table, and there was the story my mother told me about meeting him for the first time when I was 2, and there was the lunch when I was 35, and there was the UMass concert, and there are all these different things. And once those all existed, that's the point at which I thought like, wow, I wonder if I could make this into a book and figure out a way to connect it all. And of course, music is sort of the connective tissue, and there's people, but the way I wrote about my father, I really thought, when I was writing it, I was thinking, no one ever needs to see this. No one knows I'm doing this. No one's asking me to do this. And so it's totally safe. So I can write whatever I want, and if ever it gets to that point, I have the control to change it later. And I think that's why it got, for me, who's not a very emotional or open person, certainly more emotional or open than I've ever been, because I just didn't care.
Yeah, I actually, you're really onto something there insofar as like, I think in the age of TikTok, everybody's thinking about how they're gonna look on camera, and one of my favorite scenes in film ever is in Madonna, the Truth or Dare movie, when she's arguing with Warren Beatty, and it's getting kind of heated, and one of the cameramen says, Maddie, do you want to do this off camera? And Warren Beatty goes, she doesn't want to live off camera, right? But that was a prophetic moment, right? So, but I do think when you're working in such a way that you think, well, I don't care if anybody ever sees this, I don't care what this actually becomes. That's when you get to the stuff.
Yeah.
So the for me, the other big arc of the book is what you alluded to just now, is where you're sort of, I don't want to make it more dramatic than it sounds, but the half of your life you knew about was the white side of your family.
Right.
Your blackness was kind of, I want to say a mystery, but Roy Ayers is here making, he was in this tradition of blackness in the early 70s that was sort of, I don't know, there's not really a word to describe it, but the same people who were starting to celebrate Kwanzaa and who were like tracing their origins to Africa. They come in the wake of the Panthers, but they're not the Panthers, right? They're, my best friend when I was a child, his father James Benson was at the first Kwanzaa, and so on weekends I'd be hanging at Barry's house, and people would be wearing dashikis and stuff like that, and that's and Roy Ayers records were part of the conversation.
Yeah, he had a dashiki on some of those covers.
Yeah. So as you trace your heritage and come to meet people who you're related to, I mean, this is like your life is gonna be like asking you, so who are you? But how did that change your perspective? Can you describe sort of what's different for you now that you've met these new people in your life, the black side of your family?
Yeah, I mean, it all got crazy when I did 23andMe, which was not that long ago. I mean, 6 or 7 years ago, maybe less. I don't even know, not that long ago. And that really stemmed from, I mean, just sort of fast forward through the book and through my life and being so connected to my mother and her side of the family, knowing my uncle, knowing my grandparents, knowing my great-grandparents till I was 10 or 12 years old, and knowing so many cousins. I mean, I know so much about my mother's side of the family. She talks about them all the time. She has photos. I have stories. I have everything on this side.
Right.
And on my father's side, I, until recently, knew nothing. I knew that, right, it was him, his parents. He grew up in Los Angeles. His parents' names were Ruby and Roy the First, and he had 3 sisters. And I knew their names, and that he had some other kids. That was everything I knew, nothing beyond that. And so it was always weird to me to know so much from one side, so much about one side and so little about the other side. And that was, I think, just one of the reasons I tried to finally connect with him when I was 35 or something like that. I think, the pragmatic side of me was like, well, I'm 35, that means he's almost 70. If I ever want to learn anything, it's probably time. Medical history, whatever, family stuff.
That was the one that resonated with me when you said that in the book. I was like, oh yeah, no, it's important to know.
My doctor is always asking me every year, and I'd be like, I don't know. And then finally it's like, maybe I should know. That would be good to know. And so that's at least the sort of line of reasoning I used in my head to like think, okay, I think it's time to try to get a hold of my father. And fast forward, I did. Kind of went great at first, and then kind of went not great really quickly after. And that was the first time in my life when I was actually angry with him, because it was the first time I'd actually tried to connect with him.
Yeah, I was too.
Thank you. And felt unsuccessful. So, but beyond all that, really what I wanted was to learn more about history and lineage and family and all that stuff. And at the lunch that we had, he told me some things I didn't know, but not a whole lot. And he also didn't seem that interested, which I think a lot of people just don't care about that stuff. It's not that important to them. Maybe it was that, or maybe he just didn't want to tell me.
He's also a front man. I have inside information on front men. They're narcissists. Right?
All right.
This is part of it.
Who cares about these people?
I think there's more to it than that. But I think there's also, when your dude is the lead singer or something like that, he's going to have a little more of the narcissism that that we all try to battle.
LSS, lead singer syndrome.
Exactly.
So either way, I kind of walked away from that knowing a little more, and I think that made me want to know so much more, and suddenly I had no way to find out anything, especially through him. So it wasn't right then. It was years later that I did 23andMe, and that didn't tell me a ton. But through the site, a third cousin hit me and said, "Hey, we're third cousins. I have an Ayers family tree you might want to see." And he sent that to me.
So cool.
That was just like the craziest document that goes back to one enslaved man in Alabama in 1824. It has pictures of almost everybody. It has their stories. There's like a page on everyone. It's nuts. And in the family tree, it was made in 1963, and my father's there, the grandparents, his sisters, the names I know, they're all there. My great uncle. It's incredible. And it talks about the slave owner whose last name was Ayers, and I was able to research him and get in touch with a woman on that side of the family. It got really crazy and incredible. And I wrote about it. It's also meta. I wrote about that process, and that was published by NPR Code Switch. And that's when like some much closer family read that piece, and they got in touch. And that's really how I got connected with Roy's sister, my Aunt Michelet, first cousins, like people who are really close family who live in Los Angeles, who now I'm in touch with and I talk to.
Who do know him, who have been part of his life.
Who are part of his life and part of my life, and I think they feel a little bit conflicted. They're kind of secretly in the middle, because I think Roy's a little bit out of it, but I think his kids that he grew up with, I think they're not that into me. So I think it's kind of weird for the family people in the middle.
Do you think, are they worried that you're trying to scratch around for an inheritance or something?
That's my assumption. I really don't know. Yeah.
But it's also, I mean, the way, I didn't grow up in an intact family, and so, but I understand that people who did, from the inside, can feel that there are threats. And I had a friend whose family, the dad, his father was considered pretty terrible by the family. But when he finally left that family, the new family never saw the side of him that had been the villain in the old family. And none of them wanted to see the old family, because to them, these were the people who made our dude awful.
Wow.
So
that's wild.
And so, the way that people occupy different roles in different lives. Yeah. But that's what makes your narrative so remarkable, is that your temperament is such that you can enter a scene like that and not blow up the scene in a way that people tell you not to call them back.
Right. Which, I mean, it's such, I mean, every one of those scenes, actual scenes in the book, I was so nervous and trepidatious just that, like, anything I say could blow the whole thing.
Yeah.
Like, that, I mean, I don't think that's actually true, but that's what it felt like. That's what, don't say the wrong thing. And when it just kind of goes back to the question, but when we're all sitting around the table with my cousins and my aunt, it's the first time I'm meeting a lot of them, and my cousin says, "Do you identify as black?"
Yeah.
And the whole table is quiet.
How old is this cousin? It's such a young question.
60?
Yeah. Oh, no, really?
Yeah. And like a young 60.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's spectacular.
Yeah. And in my head, of course, it's like, don't fuck it up, don't fuck it up, don't fuck it up. And don't mess it up. And I was just honest. I said, no, but I don't identify as white. And I kind of went back to the first 10 years in Amherst when it just wasn't a thing. Like, it wasn't important to be a race. It was, those formative years were in this weird, unique place where everyone was some interesting mix. And it didn't matter. No one was better than anyone. No one was worse. There weren't groups of people of certain races. Everyone was just there. And that really stuck with me. And that, of course, stuck with me living in super white Seattle. Stuck with me living in much more black Fort Greene and Brooklyn. And it kind of is still the thing. I don't totally know where I fit in, but I'm also comfortable fitting in most places.
Those scenes are quite remarkable. I'm sure you must have felt it writing them that, like, it's an arrival in a place that I didn't entirely see coming. It was like it was kind of something of a surprise that it wound up there after the scenes with Roy and sort of feel diffuse. Having written the book, writing a book is a whole process. It's like you started in this interesting way. They all books start differently, I think, especially first ones. But I assume it was pretty satisfying to get through edit and have a thing, have this.
Incredibly
which
satisfying.
you can buy if you don't have
Right.
Are you planning on writing more books?
I would like to. I can't just say yes. Like, I don't, once this was like, okay, I think I'm writing a book,
Right.
I knew what I was doing, which is not to say that it was easy, that it came fast, but there was never like, oh, it could go in this direction, or maybe it should be more this. It wasn't, the end of the road wasn't totally clear, but I always knew. It just felt like I was being pulled. Like, I knew there weren't choices. I just had to put in the time and do it, and it ended up similar to, I think, how I imagined it in my head. And right now, it's like, I mean, all of this is comparable to being in a band where you have your whole life to write your first record and 6 months to write your second.
Yes.
There's no pressure. No, I have more time than that, obviously, but it just doesn't feel, there are too many options, and there are too many things I want to do, and none of them feels like the obvious thing. And this is 5 months old, so I'm still meeting people. Literally, every part of this book tour, it's tons of fun. I love doing it, and I love having these conversations, but it's also fun to come to these cities and meet people that I'm connected to or that I'm related to, which is happening in so many of these places. And so, like, it feels like it's still like a continuation of the book is still happening in real time. And I don't know that means I need to write a sequel or an add-on or whatever, but I'm just kind of doing the stuff and keeping track of everything. And I also want to write like an indie rock fiction murder mystery.
I think you should do that. Romana Clef, in which all the people you wanted to slap get killed. So,
they can tell all the real stories and make them fake.
So let's pick another bit to read.
Sure. Do you have an idea?
Well, the thing is, I'm going to pick the ones that make people feel bad.
That's fine.
There's the scene in the restaurant. Where is it?
Let's make people feel bad.
Where'd it go? I had a second ago and I went, no, not that. It's in 22.
What page-ish are you?
No, I'm around 154. The scene in the restaurant with the check.
When I'm having lunch with Roy?
No.
In the long winters?
Yeah, it's around.
Oh, that's later, isn't it? That's got to be.
I had it a second ago.
The scene with the check is like it's gonna be in.
Oh, though, actually, just the chapter 20, Easy Street. It's 4 pages, which is the longest read. If you want to pick a section from there.
Sure. Okay.
But one thing I like about this book is that it illuminates the mid 90s, which in the music business, if you don't work in it. So much change happened after 2001 that the business that Nabil is talking about in 95 you might as well be talking about people who live on the moon, right?
It's kind of true.
And I was there. My career starts in '92, right? And I was just making little tapes and not doing big national tours, but I was living in record stores. I was hip to the business, and I worked in retail promotion at one point. I assume there is no more retail promotion department inside Beggars.
But there is.
Is it really?
I think that's a thing. Well, I mean, we're selling tons and tons of vinyl, and there are record stores, but it's also like part of the ethos. So many people at Beggars, including Martin Mills at the top, came from record stores, and so I think we sort of lean unnecessarily heavy into it. It's just like part of who we are.
Retail promotion involves cold calling record stores
right.
and saying, I worked this job in fall of '95. Hi, this is John at Touch and Go. Keepone is coming through. They're going to be playing at Sudsy's, and I'd like to send you some posters.
Yeah.
And then
can you bring in a couple units for me?
And then they always say, "Oh, you're Touch and Go? You guys do Invisible, right?" I say, "Yeah. Send me the Pig Face CD." I'm like, "Well, I only have 2 of those. What are you going to do for me? Send me the Pig Face CD." And they're not going to hang up the posters, and that's the job, 8 hours a day.
While smoking cigarettes.
While smoking cigarettes.
On both sides of the color.
That's correct. So I'd like to hear a little from that world because it's such a different world.
Sure. So this is right after college. I mean, this is a sort of, I think, key decision I made in my life, which was 1993 in Seattle. It was relatively easy to go get a job, like some kind of real job, and get a salary. And my friends moved into nice apartments and got cars and everything, and I just knew, like, I want to play in a band.
Rent wasn't 100% of your paycheck.
Right. Oh, no, that people paid, it's cheap. So I knew I wanted to be in a band, and I knew that would prevent me from doing that. And so I thought, like, I should just work in a record store because that's how I'll meet people, that's how I'll get in the record business. So I was an intern at Polygram, which was one of the huge majors at the time, for this woman, Steph. So Steph from Polygram set me up with a job interview at Easy Street Records, a great store in the West Seattle Junction, an antiquated old American downtown district near the house I shared with Jason and 3 other roommates. Matt, who owned the store, was surprisingly young, in his 20s, affable with a quiet confidence. I'd never worked in a record store, but I accidentally nailed the interview when Matt explained to me, "We're not just a cool record store. We sell everything from Metallica to Roy Ayers." I told Matt that Roy was my father, and I started my new job the next day. That was the first time my father had ever done something for me, even if it was unintentional. Music was more exciting than ever. I had more access to it at Easy Street, where the senior staff constantly exposed me to previously unfamiliar artists. I worked alongside Kirsten, a wonderful pale goth with a black bob, who once explained to me the sensuality of menstrual blood while blasting Nick Cave's Let Love In. Stephen, the manager, who sang in a band that had almost been signed, and who wore a puffy white shirt. I'm just laughing as I visualize these people. Wore a puffy white shirt under a tight black vest, played the goth band Fields of the Nephilim every day. New CDs arrived daily, and we listened to everything from Portishead's gloomy, haunting debut to Gling Glow, the $24 import-only jazz vocal album by Bjork. West Seattle seemed like a separate city from Seattle, even though it was only a 10-minute drive from downtown. There were some pretty rough parts. My roommates and I each paid $154 a month for our 5-bedroom house near High Point, where there was real gang activity. West Seattle also had areas on the water around Alki Beach, where some Seattle rock stars chose to live, removed from the city. Soundgarden's Chris Cornell sometimes arrived at Easy Street around 9 p.m., when we were scheduled to close. He would start shopping as the store was clearing out, and nicely ask whoever was working to let him stay just a bit longer so he could shop in private. Pearl Jam singer Eddie Vedder shopped at Easy Street during our regular hours. I was working once when Eddie came in and bought our entire Who section, about 15 CDs. He wore a tight green ski cap, and he stood in line impatiently, fidgeting with a childlike grin on his face. The kid in front of him bought a Pearl Jam CD, and he had no idea who was standing in line behind him. This caused Eddie and me to exchange a knowing smirk. He paid with $100 bills, then bolted out the door. I watched his green cap bounce down the street until he was out of sight. My roommates and I often piled into Jason's navy blue Isuzu Trooper to see shows at Rock Candy and the Off-Ramp, or one of the other clubs in Seattle. To save money, we learned which bars sold which beers, and we filled a cooler in the back of the Trooper that was stocked according to that night's venue. Rock Candy meant Budweiser Tall Boys. The Crocodile Cafe meant Sierra Nevada Pale Ale bottles. We made trips to the car to restock our jackets between bands. My cheap rent easy street guest list privileges, and non-existent bar tabs made for an inexpensive, carefree post-college life in Seattle. Leave it there. Those are good times.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, there's so much in that like it's also. It was more affordable to be young in those days. You know,
Right.
You could make rent and buy records. So,
Yeah.
this is usually the point in the reading where we turn it over for questions, if anybody has any, and then usually there's an uncomfortable silence. But not
Until the
now.
first one,
Go
right?
ahead, bud.
What's your salary?
How much you make, Nabil?
If we weren't on the internet, we could talk after. It's a good question.
Are you
I
comfortable?
appreciate
Is it a good living?
It is, yes.
Yeah. How long did it take you to get to a point where you're making decent money?
I mean, there were points in Seattle when Sonic Boom started to do well, but that was totally, it would ebb and flow because there was a record store and there would ever be a big record or a really big season or something, but then we would, have some insurance thing and be scared. So that was always like more dependent on like, wow, let's pay ourselves $3,000 each right now, my partner and I. And that was super exciting. And then it was like, let's not pay ourselves anything and let's pay our employees. So I think it really probably wasn't until I started at 4AD. That was the first real job I had when I would have been 35.
And what did you enter as? What were you hired?
I was the head of the label.
You were hired to
Yeah, but still on a relatively like, we don't have this role. You come from a record store, let's kind of try it. Like it wasn't like a hotshot job.
What year was that?
That was 2009. But it was definitely the first time I had like a real job with a real salary. That was my first real job. Yeah. Because I went from like college to record store to owning a record store.
Yeah. I think it's a great question, young man, because like because when you start working in the music business, generally speaking, there's no money at all, right? And in my life, we were dead poor for a long old time. And I'll tell you that the first, when 4AD, Nabil's label, I signed to 4AD before you got there in 2001. And our contract had a $10,000 advance, right? I'd never seen that.
Sound like a lot?
I'd never seen that much money in one place in my entire life, right? And the first thing you have to do is call a lawyer, right? To make sure the contract doesn't say something fishy. And then lawyers are slow, right? Yeah. And I remember like constantly telling him, sign the thing, it looks fine. He's like, no, this is the process. And I was like, no, they're gonna run away, right? They're gonna, I'm still like.
And the lawyer's like, yeah, it looks good. And now it's 8 because I'm taking 2.
Well, you'll find out if somebody comes to buy this book, because when the movie people come for your book, that contract negotiation takes months. Oh, wow. And if you ever didn't have money, you sit there going, just sign it. Just, I don't care. Right. So, but you hit a comfort point 4 or 5 years into your career, right?
Right.
You hit a point where you say, I make rent in this business, and it's okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Do you listen to music when you write?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do, and I think I figured out, I mean, specifically for this book, what really helped was whatever period I was writing about, I listened to whatever I would have been listening to in that period, which is really fun. So it was, there was lots of Kiss and Kraftwerk and tons of whatever, Soundgarden and 90s music. And that was a really fun part of it. But otherwise, if I'm just normally writing, I think the thing that I figured out is I can't listen to new music. I can't listen to music I don't know, because that competes for like brain space. And what I have to listen to is music I know well enough that I don't notice it. And so that's the line right now. But always I have to listen to music. Yeah. In the back person.
When you look in the mirror, what people in your family do you see, and has that changed over time?
Oh, wow. I've never heard that question. I definitely see my father. I think I look a lot like him, especially at certain periods of my life and certain periods of his. And I really see my mother, and certain people have pointed that out when we've been together for our entire lives, now and when I was a kid. But I think that, I don't know if it's, I don't want to call it racist, but I think there's this thing that people have a harder time saying I look like my white mother than I do my black father. But I see both of my parents, probably 40% mother, 60% father is what I would say.
I'm super familiar with this. My wife is from Thailand, and when our first son was born, he looks a lot like me. But he does have the little epicanthic fold in the eye, and the tiniest bit of Asian makes everybody go, oh, it looks like his mom. My second son looks exactly like his mom. Right? Roman looks like me, but not to most white onlookers, because the little touch of race.
And I had the afro, which was the equivalent of the eyes.
Exactly, Over there. Sir, in the,
There are a lot of Ayers men that you resemble. You have the Ayers face.
Wow.
Oh yes, very good.
I can't wait. We're talking more this week. This is very exciting. Thank you.
So you've met a lot of people in the wake of publishing this book. Has your mom? Has she felt the impact of it?
Right. Oh, that's a good question. Only through me. She hasn't traveled at all in the pandemic. So only people who would have been in New York. I'm trying to think there's been a couple Zooms, but I don't think she's actually really met anyone. She only knows my stories. As an aside, she came to the book event that I did in Philadelphia, which was recently, so the book had been out for a while, and she was signing books there, which was kind of awesome. But no, she really wants to meet everybody and has done some Zooms and some calls, but hasn't really met many people. But she does feel super connected to them because that's who she is. Yeah. You got a question up front? Yeah.
You don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but are you mad at your mother for making the decision that she did and you growing up without a father? Are you mad at her for making that decision?
That is a great question and a pretty classic question that I have answered a few times. I'm not. There are points, and this is interesting, this is a book thing, but I think there were 3 drafts, and after the second draft, my editor called me and she said, look, I'm not telling you need to be mad at your mother, but what you do need to do is talk about why you're not mad at your mother if that's the case. She's like, there has to be more in this book that addresses that because that's a question that people are going to have. And so the book has more than it did. but I started really thinking about it, and I talked to my mother about it. She was great, and she's immediately like, oh, it's okay, you can be mad. You can do whatever you need to say. That's my imitation. Super understanding, super open, really like, no, you're not going to offend me, say what you need to say. And what it really came down to is no. And the thing I always think about is, the incredible job that she did, but the only time, and I did add this in because it was true, is when I did finally meet my father when I was 35 and we got along so well and it was so easy. At that moment, I did think like, wow, I wonder why, because she definitely protected me from doing that. She never said don't meet him, but she made it clear like he's flaky, he'll never return your calls, he'll never come around, he won't get back. All these things were always in my head. And so when I finally did that, I was so scared to do it. He got back to me, we met, we had an incredible lunch, and in my head, I was like, great, we can do this more. But immediately it turned to everything that she'd said, and that's where it has been ever since. So she was right.
That's why it's good that you didn't meet him when
totally
successful.
Yeah, right, or when I was a kid or something. Yeah, so, but that was the only moment where I really questioned, like, maybe I could have done this when I was 25, which is 10 years before, which is a lot of time. But in the end, I think she was right. So I don't have any anger.
Are there any genres of music that you're not particularly wild about?
Country and rap. I can answer that really easily. Yeah. I've never been into, people assume I'm into hip hop, and I don't know anything about hip hop music.
Well, a lot of old hip hop records have this guy named Roy Ayers.
I know. Somebody told me recently, I was just like, at a party or something, I met someone and he was like, yeah, someone told me to talk to you. I've been meaning to call you. They're like, talk to Nabil. He knows hip hop. And I was like, who told you that? It's just not true. And yeah, for some reason, country has just never really stuck with me. That's not to say all country and all hip hop. I love the Run DMC records and Public Enemy, but like generally, I'm kind of a guitar rock guy.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Besides your uncle, did you ever have a father figure growing up, or?
Not a single one. He's definitely the one, and he still is, and it's really, really present, important part of my life. But there were like lots of great male role models throughout. I had an incredible drum teacher when I was a kid who was more than a drum teacher. He was really just like a music guy. We would just listen to music, and like it wasn't like, here's what I'm going to teach you, go do your homework. Like, he would come over, we would listen to stuff, I would play him what I wanted to learn, we would figure it out, we would talk and hang out outside of that. So that he was really great. We had a neighbor who I'm still good friends with who was the timpani player in the Utah Symphony when we moved to Salt Lake City, and he heard me playing drums in the apartment, and so he came down and I had dinner with him 2 weeks ago in New York. So lots of people like that who weren't really father figures, but definitely positive male role models.
Has your mother ever met Roy Ayers? Any members of Roy Ayers' family?
She's met him. She would go. She used to live in Berkeley, California, before she moved back to New York 10 years ago. And when he would play there, he still tours and still plays a lot. She would go every once in a while, every few years, basically to update him on me. And this is when I was playing in bands. She would always go and like hang out early, whatever, try to go backstage or get there and give him my CD and say like, just hi, here's Nabil's new album, and like talk for 1 minute. And so the nothing longer than that. And I don't think she's met anybody else though, just him.
I'd love to wrap with one more reading. If you would turn to page 250. What is that? Yeah. Maybe 251. Fill us in on who Karen is.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And start with after several weeks.
Okay, so Karen, so I was talking about doing 23andMe and getting that family tree, and what happened to the...
Does everybody know what 23andMe is?
That's the DNA test, yeah. So this cousin reached out and said, I have an Ayers family tree, and I was, fascinated with this document and tried to look up the people who were mentioned in it and couldn't find any more info. As some of you probably know, it's really hard to research enslaved Americans. But it talked about this guy, Dr. Ayers, who was a slave owner who lived in this small town, Ashland in Benton County, Mississippi. So I started researching him, and pretty quickly, it was very easy. In some book, found this, this guy, small town, seems like the right age, right name, all these things, and kind of thought like, wow, maybe this is the guy, and went to that site, findagrave.com,
yeah.
And there was a woman named Karen Ayers who had left some kind of like, so thankful for our ancestors message on the site. And her email address was right there. So to me, I'm like, wow, this is the living descendant of the guy who owned my ancestors, and that's her Gmail address. And so I emailed her, and I wrote this email. I was just like, that was a long time ago. I have no ill will. I'm not after anything. I'm a successful adult. I'm really just trying to learn more about my family. Can you tell me anything? And she got right back in touch. She emailed like that night or the next morning, incredibly open, which is very unusual for this scenario. I think a lot of people know that when you send an email like mine, people don't want to respond. They're afraid of, whatever, lots of things.
Yeah, I've read several. There have been big stories in Esquire or whatever about things like that.
But she got right back and just opened up. And so, let's see, so where are we? So we started emailing, and she was just like, and she also is like a hobby genealogist. So she knows things about the Ayers farms and was sending me photos and documents and all this stuff. And it's kind of this incredible relationship. And so, let's see, we'll start. Okay, yeah, that's a good background for this. So, after several weeks, I realized that I told Karen a lot about myself, but I hadn't learned much about her beyond her current life and her ancestors. So I asked her. Her reply was extraordinary. This is Karen emailing me. I was born in Fort Knox, Kentucky, at a United States Army hospital. My father met my mom in Berlin when she was attending business school. My dad was in Germany for a couple years. I have a photo of my mom on the ship coming to America for the first time. Pretty powerful. She's such a good emailer. Karen went on to tell me that her grandfather had been a POW in both World War I and World War II, and that he was beaten near to death and imprisoned for stealing potatoes. Then she told me about her mother. My mother was forced to be part of Hitler's youth. She wore a uniform. Hitler abolished all religious activities in Germany and enticed children, and if they didn't adapt to his belief or ideals, it was that or the threat to murder one's families. For the entirety of our relationship, I'd assumed that my ancestors, the ones who Karen's ancestors may have owned, were the only people who struggled. But the story of her grandfather being a POW in 2 different wars was harrowing. Then I thought about my Black Jewish lineage. What does it mean for me to be corresponding with a woman who was descended from enslavers on her father's side and Nazis on her mother's? My frequent correspondence with Karen continued, and she started to send bits of genealogical information, letters from the Ayers farm, photographs of gravestones, family trees that dated back to the 1500s. Even if we weren't related, I was learning more about my ancestry, and Karen and I had fostered an obvious connection.
Follow through to the end.
Okay. In November 2018, I published an essay on Code Switch, NPR's race and culture vertical, about my own racial identity and my recent discovery of my family tree. My essay had originally focused on Karen and the possibility that we might actually be related, but my editor pushed me to focus the story on my relationship, or lack thereof, with my father. The final piece was more about what I was missing than what I'd found, less about my unusual relationship with Karen, and more about what it means to have a father who lives in the same city, but with whom I have no connection. When NPR tweeted my story to its 7 million followers, I received a mountain of feedback, most of which ended with, "I can't wait to see what happens next." That, compounded with the email that Karen sent immediately after she read my story, encouraged me to continue my search. Karen's email read, "I want you to know, I want us to be related. If we are not, I think I might feel a measure of disappointment. This isn't over yet, so let me ask you, what you sent today isn't everything, is it? Gosh, I'm hoping there is more." Karen and I had exchanged dozens of emails, and we'd created an obvious connection. But this was the first time she'd expressed a desire for us to be related. Just the thought that she hoped for that, and the fact that she'd opened up about the possibility in her mind for the first time, caused me to feel a familial bond.
Nabil Ayers. Thanks everybody for coming. If you haven't got a book yet, I recommend it. It's right at the store, and if you didn't get your signed earlier, we'll be around. Thanks.
Thank you, John. This has been
Sure.
amazing. Thank you so much.
Woo.
Flyleaf. You're very good at
Talk to
that.
that. I'm right down the road.
Thank you, everybody.
You and me, right?
What is
Was that- I didn't German.
Thank you.
But yeah, I think this will happen for you. That like, I remember the first book. This for me.
Right.